Fantastic.
Beautiful.
All right, we'll make a start today. So today our Dom, or our senior citizen, has always been Trev.
Yeah, it's been relegated.
He's been
Downgraded.
downgraded. And in fact, he's nearly going to be 80 this year. So that's a fantastic thing. And look, his health is brilliant. But we're being superseded by someone even older.
Oh.
So David, is it 86 this year?
Next Sunday.
Next Saturday. Well,
I'm going to tell you a little story first of all. Years ago, we spent about the first 10 years of our marriage. We've been married 59 years, I think, now. Working amongst Aborigines and in South Australia, North Queensland, and Wyndham up at the top of WA. But I was the rector of the parish of Wyndham, which considers about 1,400 people. That was my first parish, and in one of the most isolated places on earth. But I wanted to start a group of children, about 26 children. I found from my RI lessons at school that most of them knew absolutely nothing whatever about God or about Jesus or about any kind of sort of rough moral values. And so I started a group in our home on Wednesday afternoons in which about 26 children turned up, aged from about 7 to about 12, and I tried to teach them a bit about God and a bit about Jesus and a bit about these sort of stories. And I was trying to teach them to pray, and I'd get them kneeling in a circle, and I'd say, all right, now you pray, and I'd tell them what to say, and they'd go, no. And then one day, we'd been doing this for a few weeks, and there was a lot of disquiet when they were praying, when I was praying. And I said to them, what's the trouble? Why are you so restless? And the little girl said, no, Mr. McDougall, we feel stupid talking to somebody who's not there. And I said, but God really is there, and he does answer prayer. And this little girl, age 7, changed my life. And she said to me, how do you know? I said, I know because God answers my prayers, that's why I'm here. And after our little meeting was over, I thought, how do you know? Rang in my mind, as it still does, I can still hear this little darling say that. And I knelt down by my bedside and I said, oh God, I know you're there, I know you answer prayer, I know you keep your promises in the Bible. I've claimed them hundreds of times, and you've always answered. Please help me to show these children that you really are there and you really do answer prayer. And I said, it's up to you. And so the next Wednesday afternoon we got married for prayer, and I said, I'd done the accounts for the parish. We needed $120. And 50 years ago that was a lot of money actually. We had about 20 people in our congregation, about 4 or 5 white people, and all the rest were Aboriginals. And you had to watch they didn't take the money out rather than put it in. And so I said to the children, look, we need $120 for our church by tomorrow afternoon. And I want you to pray that God will send us $120 to pay all our bills by tomorrow afternoon. And they all looked. And I said, we're going to claim a promise. Psalm 50, verse 15, Robinson Crusoe's prayer. Call upon me in the day of trouble, saith the Lord, and I will hear you, and you will pray, and I will rescue you, and you will praise me. God answered Robinson Crusoe's prayer. What happened? Oh, I haven't read Robinson Crusoe. He was wrecked on an island on his own in Engliston, and he was there for years, and he built up his home. And then one day, when after he prayed, he walked down to the beach, and there were footsteps in the sand. And when he followed them, he found there was a black man there, and he called him Man Friday because that was the day he was found. So I said, we'll claim Robinson Crusoe's prayer. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will answer you, saith the Lord. And that's what I want you to do. We're going to kneel, and I'm not going to tell you what to say. So you pray and ask God to hear our prayer and send us $120 by tomorrow afternoon. So we all knelt down, and this little girl, age 7, said, please God send the church $120 by tomorrow afternoon, amen. And then I looked around, and then the policeman's daughter, Meryl, she spoke up and she said, please God send the church $120 by tomorrow afternoon, amen. And I looked around and I said, anyone else? Everybody else was looking around like that. And I said, all right, Heavenly Father, it's your reputation that's at stake, not mine, amen. So we went up at a little meeting and we finished off. We always go to a biscuit and a soft drink after the meeting was over. Then Anne came in and she said, oh, here's the 3 letters for you. So I said, oh, I was talking to 3 of these children. And I said, oh, thanks dear. And I opened up the first one and I said, oh, here's a cheque for $50. And there was a death-like hush in the room. And there were 26 pairs of eyes bulging. And a little voice said, geez, do you think it's working? And I said, yes, it's working. God is answering prayer. And then that afternoon, after going home, somebody gave a $30 donation. 50 plus 30. The next morning we had a jumble sale for our Aboriginal people. Some people down in the valley had come up to our little church once on the Round Australia trip, and they saw the work we were doing, and they were Methodists, they weren't even Anglicans. And they said, we want to help you, we want to pray for you. So we said, sure. And so they kept sending us boxes of second-hand clothes and second-hand razor blades too, all sorts of odd things. And so we had a jumble sale the next morning, the Thursday morning, and we made $40 exactly. But 2 of them had prayed. And that afternoon, knock came on the door. And there was this chap who was a local builder. We were friendly, we weren't friends. But he's a nice guy. And he said, oh Dave, he said, I'd just been down the pub. And I was having a beer, and I was thinking to myself, that David McDougall, he's doing a real good job. I think I'll give him a donation. Do you mind if I give you a donation? No. The donation's all right. And so he took out a roll. He's being a tradesman himself of his selfies. You know, the ones you don't declare into tax, I suppose. And he had a roll of them like that, the cashies. You know. And he's just took a handful at random and put the elastic bands around it again and says, and I'm saying, oh, thank you. He says, she's right, mate, she's right. And well, I'd got my clerical reflexes under control and counted the money. It was exactly $120. And next week, he came to our prayer time. And I said, all right, we're praying. And there's all these couple of dozen pair of eyes all looking at me, very quiet. And I said, you know last week I asked you to pay $120 for the church by Thursday afternoon? Yes. And I told them what had happened. And there was this hush. And I said to them, now do you know what that means? No. I said, God heard your prayers and he answered your prayers separately to show that he really is there and he really does answer prayer. And they were astonished. And I said, "And do you know what that means?" No? I said, "Next time I ask you to pray for money, all of you pray and we'll really clean up." Oh, I could tell you how we did clean up in a completely different way, but I could tell you so many stories. But that was those children. And that's the sort of work we've been involved in, that God answers prayer. And when you pray, you release the power of 1 billion stars in the universe. It's there for our disposal once we pray. And God does answer prayer. And even the little 7-year-old child. In an unmistakable way. What happened to me? I was brought up in Newcastle. And my father was an accountant at the steelworks. We lived right next to it. And he rose to be one of the greatest financial minds in Australia. He ran the whole EHP in Australia just from inside his head. And brilliant man, great man. And we had 3 children. I was the eldest. And I grew up, went through primary school, failed primary school. I had to repeat 6th class. Nobody repeats 6th class. But I did. I managed it. And then I went on to Newcastle Boys High School and got the 4th year, but we were in difficulties, our families in that year, and I was very upset and distressed, and I failed 4th year, though I'd done quite well scholastically previously to that, and I failed 4th year. Had to leave and take a trade. And because I was interested in electrical things, I became an electrical fitter at the steelworks. That was my trade. God can so bless our parents. That was one of the best things that happened to me in the whole of my life. And so I went through my apprenticeship and became a tradesman. But at the end of that time, I left the steelworks because my father died when I was 20. And Mum was left fairly poorly off, and so I left home, and she was able to open the house for a boarding house. And I moved to Sydney, and in Sydney I couldn't get a job as an electrical fitter, so I got a job as a mechanic. And I did a second trade, did the exams, did the apprenticeship, and became an electrical mechanic as well. And I worked at Garden Island, Naval Depot, and in various places around Sydney, in factories, built wide-up houses, wide-up factories, all sorts of things. And so I finished up with an A-grade electrical licence and a grade C licence in New South Wales. That's a supervisor's licence. But when I was 16 and still at high school, something happened to me. I started to get an interest in girls. I used to think they were fearsome creatures at first, even though I had a sister. And I was so shy about girls. And I was so shy about girls, I thought, oh, I could never get married. I would be too ashamed, too shy to even hold hands with a girl, let alone do anything else. And so I decided to commit suicide. And I worked out elaborate ways of committing suicide. But then one night, a friend of mine took me to a dance. And we went to that dance, and it was a strange thing. 3 girls and 40 boys turned up. And as in those days, boys didn't dance with boys. He said, oh, I know somewhere we can go. And he said, there'll be a lot of girls there, won't there, for years. So he took me along to this meeting a few hundred yards down the street. And there, for the first time, I heard the gospel preached. Last Victorian preacher, and after he'd finished, I put my hand up. Yes, I was a sinner. And he said, young man, I see you. I'd like to go down the front. And I knelt at the back of that hall, the Methodist Church in Newcastle, and I asked Jesus to be my saviour. And straight away the Holy Spirit came upon me, and I was born again, And I stood up a different David. I started going to the Baptist church at the time, and they challenged me to give my life to Christ, and I read the New Testament, and I found that I didn't study. I always liked to know how things worked, and I studied. I read books and books. I've got a lot of thousands of books, and I'll show you some of them in a little while. And I started to have my mind opened up considerably, and I became convinced that Jesus was the Son of God, and that the whole of my life should be spent serving Him. It was the most selfish thing I could think of doing. And so I went down to Sydney, and I started witnessing as a Christian amongst the tradesmen there, and I found these people called communists. And I worked alongside them, and all day long they were preaching communism to me. What a wonderful world it was going to be when everybody was communists all over the world. And I'd never heard of them, so I went to the communist bookshop and I bought some of their books. I've still got them in my bag here, more than 60 years later. And I started reading the Communist Manifesto, the Central Left, Lenin, Gramsci. I read the works, studied them all. And I used to say to the communists when they said, you should become a communist, David, not a Christian. And I'd say, no, I said, you can't change the world unless you change people in here, because if you spread communism, all you're going to spread is evil. And all the problems that we've got in government and jail and everything, I said, unless you change people in here, you're not going to change the world. And I was right. And we were debating with each other. I admired their commitment, because they gave a third of their time, a third of their income to communism. And they were trained. They went to I went to some of their meetings, and I was astonished at the thorough training that they were giving people in spreading communism. And I saw 3 men controlling crowds of unionists, because I joined the union, of course, and 3 men controlling a crowd of 300 or 400 tradesmen and women with 3 men. I won't go into what they did. It was so simple. They just simply controlled the PA. And when one of the communists turned up, they turned the volume up when he spoke, and they all spoke. And when somebody else who was against them spoke, they turned the volume down. You can hear them. It was a simple technique, but it worked. And so they taught me the importance of training. And I knew I had to be trained. And so I was trained in evangelism and street evangelism and all sorts of things like that. And then I felt God calling me to go through law college. And I promised God, I said I'd go anywhere that He called me, want me to go and do anything He wanted me to do. I felt that was the best commitment I could make with my life. Little did I know. He's given me a fantastic life, great wife, who's 100% with me. And we met in the beach mission. And so I went through law college for 4 years. I had no money. And they said to me, oh, well, David, this is the committee that I did a leaving certificate, passed that, and went on to Moore College, and they said to me, David, how are you going to finance yourself for the next 4 years of study? And I said, oh, there's no problem. I said, because when my dad died and I stopped crying, I knelt down by my bedside and I said, oh God, Heavenly Father, I know you adopted me. That's what Paul says. I said, I'm going to adopt you now. You're my father. You're my daddy now. And so I want you to watch over me, and if I need, give me a kick in the pants. And if you need me to do something for you, I'll do it. But you're my daddy now. You're my father. Amen. And he did. And I said, I'll do anything you want me to do, go anywhere, but at the end of my life I put a nice home to live in. We've got a very nice place in Trafalgar. And so I became a minister. Went through Moore College, 4 years of Moore College. And again, I said to the committee, and they said, how are you going to finance 4 years of study? I said, it's all right. My father is a multi-millionaire and he's given me a checkbook. And all the checks are signed and the amounts left empty. And I said, And there was sort of hush. And I thought, I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, how can we get him to give us a donation? I know why he is this thing. And I said, oh yes, quoting Psalm 50 again, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Yes, the promises of God saw me through in 4 years of Moore College. I would pray for money. The money would just turn up. Or I'd get a job as an electrician somewhere. And my trade saw me through. And so at the end of that time, I pulled out because Andy came along, we were going together all that time, and we got engaged after about 2 years courtship, and then we had another 2 years engagement. And we felt it was getting a bit long, so I walked out of the exams and left 4 exams that I felt I could pass. I wanted to pass Greek and everything, but I started, we had a very interesting lecture from a Sydney dentist on communism, and I really agreed with him, and there were a couple of fellows in the college that I thought were communist plants, and I was right too, because I'd learned to recognise them and the things they said, because I'd worked with them for several years. And so I knew then that communism was a tremendous challenge, and the church was not aware of it, and that was not aware that it was getting penetrated and infiltrated by communists. And that's going back 60 years ago. I'll tell you a little bit later what some things, but so I failed 3 exams. I didn't fail them, I just didn't do them. Because I thought, well, no, I really want to study Greek. And so I spent 5 hours a day reading Greek, and I was expelled from Moore College. And I said, oh, good, we can get married now. We'd only been engaged 2 years. and I said to Anne, I rang her up and told her, and I said, can we get married next Saturday? She said, no, I'm going to have a proper wedding. And so I had a proper wedding. And I got a job on the Flying Doctor base in Ceduna, South Australia. And our honeymoon was a trip down to Ceduna. And there I was the radio operator, and as an electrician I rebuilt and redesigned the electrical system on their base and saved them lots of money in electricity. And being a registered nurse, did a bit of flying with the Flying Doctor and a bit of nursing, and our first child there. And that's where we became in contact with Aboriginals. And so at the end of that year, I'd worked myself out of a job, and they said, well, look, you've passed the rest of your exams, you've got your degree, but there's a minister up in Queensland, Melbourne, who needs help in his parish because they've got an Aboriginal community there. And with your experience, it'd be a good place to go. So I was ordained in Brisbane Diocese as an Anglican minister and served there for 3.5 years. And then they asked me if I'd go up to Lyndon in Northwest Australia. But while I was there, and this is very interesting, while I was there, we had a group organised who came to our church hall, and the minister said to me, oh, this group, they come here and there's a lot of people around here interested in them. I think one of them should, he said, they're a political group, and he said, I think one of us should be there just to represent the church, and it's not going to be me. So I thought, well, there's only one left. So off I went, and there's a chap, his name was Don Martin. and he gave a talk on communism. There was a book that had been recommended to me by about 3 weeks previous to that by a young American. He said, if you can get a copy of that book and read it, he said, read it. And there it is. None dare call it treason. Has anybody read it?
What's it called?
None dare call it treason.
No.
By John Stormer. John Stormer was an American Christian, and he was disturbed at the penetration of American politics by communism in all its disguises, because it comes in all sorts of fronts. It's a chameleon, all sorts of names, but the same philosophy is underneath. And that book sold 30 million copies. And at the same time, I met another meeting that Eric Butler came, and I got to know Eric personally, and he brought a new young fellow who'd come across from Kenya and started a farm here, and was familiar with the communist assaults in Africa, and his name was Jeremy Lee, and Jeremy and I became very good friends. And Jeremy is one of the great, how many of you know Jeremy Lee or heard of him? Good. Well, he's a good mate. And died a dreadful death. But that's where we started working on communism. I then published some articles in the local newspaper, and the editor said that there were 4 of them, and I was attacked by some of the local clergy, unsurprisingly from my point of view. And from there on, I started really fighting communism. And in the synods from Brisbane Diocese, with the church meetings, I heard one of the leading intellectuals of the diocese, had a PhD and something like that, and he moved this motion, which I recognised straight away as communist propaganda. And so I stood up and opposed Keith Rayner in the synod. I was only a curate, absolute nobody. And I was told the curate what he was, and I said this motion could come from the front pages of the Communist Tribune. I said it's so communist, and I tore it to bits. And we had a vote, and it split the synod into 2. And I lost the motion. But nevertheless, it really got the people there. So many worried, and they suddenly started to wake up that communism was right there with them, right amongst them. It was amongst their clergy, it was amongst their laity, who were trying to get control of the synod. And so, to get rid of me, they eventually got me up to Wyndham in Northwest Australia. And we were there for 5 years. And the bishop said to me on one occasion, "What's wrong with communism?" I said, "Well, according to Solzhenitsyn, in Russia alone, the communists have slaughtered something like 40 million people." Holy shit, puffing his pipe. And then we had a Victorian up there working amongst the Aboriginal, a fellow called Stan Davey. He was a communist, and he was working amongst. He was actually the Churches of Christ youth leader at communist target positions, and he had great control over the minds of youth. Lenin says, we must capture the youth. Lenin said the less revolutionary is an immoral youth. And Davey had abandoned his wife, Joan, who we had stay with us on one occasion, and their 2 little girls left them in a tent up at Bairnsdale, and taken off with his 20 years younger secretary. And Jim Richardson, who came from a very exquisite grammar school here in Melbourne, that had been indoctrinated in communism and communist ideas and socialist ideas at that school. And they came up trying to infiltrate the Aboriginals. And so we had a lot of conflict with him. And it was a battle, it was a struggle, but I knew what was going on. And so we preached the gospel to our Aboriginal friends, and many of them came to Christ. And the Aboriginal women, we had some wonderful Christians amongst them. And the fascinating thing is that they saw that the white way of philosophy, especially Christianity, was far superior than their Aboriginal religion. And do you know, it was a bit of a shock to a lot of people, but the women would have their baby sons circumcised in the hospital before they left, so they could never be made a member of the tribe, and so that the Aboriginal tribal religion would die out. Isn't that right? And we have this recurrence of that's happening now. You can see it in churches in the Shire. You know, we acknowledge the Aboriginal elders and the respect of their elders. This is Aboriginal, how do they call it?
Sacred ground. Sacred ground.
Sacred, the worship of your ancestors, you know.
Of their elders.
The dream town.
And this is just plain paganism, you know. And they're trying to split Australia into two states.
Yes.
That what they're planning to do, the communists, is to make a separate state for the Aboriginal people. And they're killing them up over the Northern Territory. And what's happened, it's never reported in the news, it's pretty terrible. But they're all the same. They've penetrated all our political parties for all my lifetime. They penetrated Monash University. Monash is General Monash was a Jewish general, and they named a university after him. But at Monash they had a Jewish lecturer 50 years ago who preached communism to the students there. And so turned out, and socialism, same thing really. And so Victoria was loaded with these sort of politicised students, and they moved on up into government. And we're now reaping the kind of laws that they like, that they love, the laws of control, and the penetration of the schools. There are little children being sexualised into communist ages, and they're getting them quite young now in the schools. So that there's this penetration of almost every work of life. When I was having my troubles with my bishop up in North West Australia, I had a visit from the head of the Bush Church Aid Society and the Evangelical Australian Society, and he was the director of it throughout Australia, and he sat down for lunch with us, and I spoke about how I stood up against communist motions in our synod in Western Australia, and how I'd split the synod again. I split Melbourne Synod when I was there. and I'll tell you what, when you've told the Melbourne Synod that about communism and the motion was completely communistic, and bang, 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 and when you get yelled at and screamed at and whistled at and booed for 10 minutes with no attempt by the Archbishop, who was the chairman, to call them into line. You know what it's like to stand for Jesus. Somebody said once, it takes guts. You know. And so, in the churches I'm for it, and eventually, I was leader of Cranbourne for 11.5 years. And they used to give me all the parishes. But then, and I used to go out and visit people at night, I win them to Christ, and So dozens and dozens of people come to the Lord Jesus and become a strong Christian parish. And with my communist experiences, I trained them. We had Bethel Bible study when the person came to Christ. They did 2 years of Bible study. And then we did total health with the help of the Seventh-day Adventists. And we also did a counselling course, that's right. So people could gossip the gospel in their streets. I was visited a young woman on one occasion who had 4 children, and I just happened to drop in to see her as I did, and she had a whole lot of other women from the street, all young women, all young mothers, about 8 of them, I think, something like that. And I sort of sat in the corner and listened to them. And I was saying, my gosh, I worked with some of the toughest guys on earth, with the Wharfies in Sydney, and I've had lunch with them, and I've never heard them talk about their private life like this. But here they all were, helping each other, helping with the kids' problems, helping with husband problems, helping with sexual problems, really intimate stuff. And they were helping each other. And I thought, this is incredible. And so we started counselling, of course, and we're training our church people to be counsellors so they could gossip the gospel and help their neighbours in the same way. It worked very well. We had people come from 50 miles away to our classes. And because I've learnt that from the communists, you need training. You need training. It's all very well to be against something, but to fight an enemy, you've got to have that soldier's training. And you've got to read and think and discuss and debate, and you've got to have courage. And communism hasn't taken a big... I'll just show you some of the books that I've got here. I brought along. Here's my mate of mine, 10 Rock. You don't need to be, it's just ordinary people that God calls decisions. 10 Rock. I apologise for this because I printed them all out and forgot to put them in. I've got a folder here. I've got 10 of these. That's all I could really afford to make. But I've got a number of sermons to talk about power, the problem of power, and the problem of how Jesus being the Lord of creation. And I've also got a thing called On Target from the League of Rights, which is still going. It's run from Adelaide, actually, On Target. And I'll put one in, but I suggest that you just look it up on your computer, because it's the sanest group that I've ever come across as far as these things, but they're hated, they're called anti-Semites and all sorts of nothing of the sort, because there's a very strong Jewish contingent in Melbourne that's supported them financially for many years. And so there's so much I could go on with. And a recent book that should be read by all of us is Silent Invasion by Clive Hamilton. Clive's I think he's one of the Canterbury universities, I've forgotten which one now. And I've been in correspondence with Clive because he's talking about the invasion of Australia by China. Did you know that every port in Australia is now owned by the Chinese? Something you did? Okay. And I left the ministry, been 11.5 years at Cranbourne. I was absolutely wrecked and just exhausted, and I became the executive director of the Far East Broadcasting Company and moved up to Sydney. And they have radio broadcasts right throughout China, Russia, the Pacific. Wonderful missionary society. And as the director, I went up to China for a trip to see how the radio was doing up there, and came back with the most astonishing interviews and astonishing people I've ever met who'd come to Christ through the broadcasts. One young woman who she's only about 22, 23, and she became a Christian through listening to the radio. And And she was so enthused filled with the Holy Spirit, and so keen to spread that there was something better than communism available. Free, it came through the air. And so what she did, she had a tape recorder, and she used to record the weekly broadcasts of FEBC and put them on tape, and then she would go around to all the markets. You know, you have the little markets here. She'd go around there with her tape recorder and an amplifier, and she would play the broadcasts to hundreds of people at a time. And when I got to know her, I only met her once, but when she used to get on her bike and she'd ride around all the markets, and she'd started 22 churches and led something like 17,000 people to Christ in the midst of communist Russia. So never think we can't beat them. That's just one young woman.
Because, you know, like on the farm, we know the ports are being taken over, but we also know a lot of people here have got farms. And the farms are being taken over too through legislation.
That's right. Well, this has happened up in New South Wales and Queensland. The communists, they've been taken over by China, for the most part, and there's the whole water problem up in New South Wales and Queensland, which is very serious because look, our constitution has been taken over. I used to quote the constitution. I've got my own copy. And I was taught the constitution when I was in primary school by our teacher there. And just, not the whole of it, of course, but stuff that he thought was interesting for us. And I was in 6th class. And, but the criteria of Hawke and Whitlam and John Howard and Fraser, Malcolm Fraser, they're all communists, and don't kid yourself otherwise. I tried to tell the people that in Crandon, I had the Republic come and talk to us in Crandon on one occasion, but one of the wealthy businessmen there called me a crackpot. Oh yeah, I don't mind. And so that
What do you see is the best way for us to fight communism or to work against it?
good question. What's the best way? In the first place, I think prayer. And in the second place, you've got to take a stand. Fight it. Resist it. And question politicians. Question clergy. You've got to, you see, the communists are active. And what's happening now after the whole COVID fiasco is that people are settling back and thinking, oh, everything's all right. But just as I've been told, I haven't been able to check it out, but I've been told that just in this last week, and they've passed a law saying anybody who's not jabbed is a terrorist. That gives the police freedom to shoot us as terrorists. In fact, I saw in the news on the radio, on the TV, that Daniel Andrews has built a $60 million factory somewhere, although it didn't say where it was, in which they train police officers on how to deal with terrorists. And you see them kicking in the door and taking their guns out and banging the guns out. And on this film, they tell us what they're going to do. And we don't believe them because it's so against our Christian background as Australia.
I grow up in a People's Council. We've started to form little groups, and one of them is to go to the council, right? To start off with our councils. Now, what would your advice be, Mark?
You've got to be persistent. You've got to wear them down.
So, yeah, I say people power too, and everybody. We've got to start standing up in our areas, you know, and even our border area to the Borbor, to the Latrobe Valley, you know. And we've got to back, and we've got to. Is that? Am I right in saying that way and fight? We have to. We have to go in there, and if. I don't care if I get arrested, you know, if they're going to.
Look, do you know what that little girl that ask me that vital question. How do you know?
How do you know?
And start talking to people about it. How do you know? Because they don't. They'll lie and lie and lie and lie. And the reason is that the communists will lie and lie and lie and lie. So let me give you a little bit of a background to the history of communism. And it comes from a corrupt form of the Jewish religion called the Kabbalah. But historically speaking, after the flood, there were two. And if you want to learn about the flood, you have to read up on what I've written. You've written in the folder here. Please pass these around, because I've only done 10, but if anybody wants any more, let me know and I'll print some more out. But you had this one group, the descendants of Shem, who became the Arabs and the Israelite people. And then you had another group, the descendants of Ham, who went to Africa. And then you had a third group, the descendants of Japheth, who went around the top of India and those places, and eventually a group of them settled in what we now call the Ukraine. The Ukrainians started, they were called in Russian the Khazars, and they lived in southern Russia, and they became a mighty trading nation, and Poland was their route to the sea. And so you have this very powerful trading nation, but a pagan trading nation. And then with the rise of Christianity from Constantinople, the Christians, such as they were, the Orthodox Christians, started pushing up into the Khazar territory. And then from the east, the southeast, you had the Mohammedans who now adopted, the Arabs who now adopted Mohammedanism, pushing up from that direction. They were very militant in their religion. And so the kings, they had a dual kingship, the kings of the Khazars decided that they wanted a religion that they could use to unite the Khazar people. And they invited a speaker from each of these three groups to come and address them. And the result of it was that the Jewish rabbi who spoke to them said, "Oh, we are the original people of God, and we are the ones that God has chosen. We are the rulers of the world." And so that the king said, "Oh, good, that sounds like a good religion which would unite our people." And so that's what they adopted. The year I've read to, I don't know quite which year it was, which century, but one book I've got says the year 641, and the other one says 741. But if you want to read about it, read a book by a Jewish man, Arthur Kessler. He's a very famous intellectual. He wrote a book called The 13th Tribe, which is an excellent history of the Khazars. But they had this fanatical idea of being rulers of the world. That came right through their pagan religion, and it came right back through this corrupt form of Judaism, the religion of the rabbis. And so that the two different racial groups, the Israelites, the few that were left over after the Romans killed all of them in 1870, they were called the Judeans because they lived in the bottom part of Judea. But the Khazars then came to be called the Jews. Now the Judeans are not Jews. They're a different race of people. And most of the Jews here in Australia, as far as I can work out, have come from that Judean group. And they don't always know themselves. But from the Khazars, the word Jew only appears in history in the 16th century in a play, in an English play. For the first time, they are called the Jews. They're actually thrown out of England by one of the Edwards, was it? Yeah, I think it might have been Edward II.
Second or third.
Second or third, yeah. My wife's a historian. And there were no Jews, that is, the Khazars in England for several hundred years until Cromwell. They bribed Cromwell and financed him and got back in again and destroyed it. But all the early communists, every single one of them was a Khazar, was a Jew. And they had a lot of opposition from the Judean portion. You had all these people infected with this idea of world control. We've just got to be, you've got to keep asking that question, how do you know when they tell you things? That to me is one of the greatest counters against communism that I know of. And my bishop in North West Australia said to me, what's wrong with communism? Well, 100 million people slaughtered in China for one thing. I strongly recommend that you pray for Australia.
Yes, we have to pray.
And you pray for guidance, because if you ask, you see, the Bible teaches us that you're either ruled by law or by ethics. And the events at Mount Sinai were very important in the history of the world, because all the nations around Israel, when Moses brought them out of Egypt, they were all ruled by law. They had the king or pharaoh or ruler, whatever they called them, and then they had a whole hierarchy to enforce the laws of the ruler, as we do in Australia, you see. And Israel, when Moses brought them out of Egypt, they were all ruled by law. They had the king or pharaoh or ruler, whatever they called them, and then they had a whole hierarchy to enforce the laws of the ruler, as we do in Australia, you see. And what happened at Mount Sinai was quite different. It was a new thing, because always there's this problem of association. How do we control human sinfulness? Because it's passed on from generation to generation. I've got a theory about that. I won't mention it if you'd like me to, but at Mount Sinai, God entered into a covenant with that group of people, what's called a suitable covenant. And God was the king, no human being. And Israel was 12 tribes, each one ruled by a separate leader, a chieftain, we called in the Bible. I'm not sure what the Hebrew is, but so that you had a dispersal of power. Power is not focused in one person. And that continued on for about 400 years. See, you have the 10 Commandments, which are all about relationships, about caring for each other, about being loyal and